Alexei Navalny, one of the loudest critics of President Putin, has died in prison above the Arctic Circle. Navalny was a huge thorn in Putin's side, using social media to highlight corruption in the Russian government. He was poisoned by the nerve agent novichok in Russia and probably only survived due to his family's push for him to be treated in Germany. But after he recovered, he chose to return to Russia, knowing he would be arrested immediately.
Не молчите, сопротивляйтесь, выходите на улицы. Никто.
What you're hearing here is his social media video message to his supporters, and in it he's saying, "I'm asking you not to keep silent, to keep fighting, to go out on the streets. No one but us can defend us, and we are many. If we want something, we will get it." I'm Leah Boleto, and on the Sky News Daily, our international correspondent Diana Magnay, who met Alexei Navalny when she was our Moscow correspondent. Later in the podcast, we'll also look at the fallout of Labour's big wins at the double by-election with our political correspondent Rob Powell. But first, let's look at the life and death of Alexei Navalny. Diana, can you tell me a bit of insight into the type of man he was? You met him once.
I met him once, but I've seen him a lot at various demonstrations over the last decade. And I met him once in his office, actually, at the beginning of COVID. And he was an incredibly charismatic man, full of energy, full of dynamism, had real presence. We were asking him for an interview, and he was quite reluctant to give Western press interviews because his message was meant for Russians and the Russian people, and he didn't want to be characterised as a Western stooge. So the interviews that he did give to Western press were pretty few and far between. And he refused to give me an interview, but he was very charming about it. He said, well, you know, it's COVID times and I just can't do that. And I was like, please. Anyway, he was charming, charismatic. But I think much more is that he was just unbelievably determined and brave, and the kind of courage that we saw from him to interrogate what happened to him when he was poisoned, to come back to Russia. Basically, he said because he was a Russian politician, he had to be there with his people. It was his values, it was his country. An incredible character and figurehead for all the things that Russia is not.
Your thoughts then, because he was 47 in relatively good health. Are you quite shocked by what happened?
I mean, I'm just appalled by what's happened. I guess that we all should have expected it, because when you are sentenced to decades in a Russian jail, it's not really going to end well. So essentially, it was a death sentence. He's already survived poisoning by novichok, which is a Soviet-era nerve agent. And then he has been in prison since February 2021. So that's 3 years where he's been held in solitary confinement a lot of the time. We were getting the message via social media. You know, he would post via his lawyers on Instagram and on Twitter, X, and we saw him quite regularly in court appearances, and he seemed pretty robust. And I've just been watching video from his court appearance via video link from his prison in the north of the country to a court, where he seems actually not as thin as we've seen him before. And he's smiling and he's joking with the prosecutors and the judge, who are both smiling back at him. It does not look like the video of a man who has less than 24 hours to live. So I'm sure we will never find out what killed him. But yesterday he did not look like a man who was about to die.
Extraordinary, isn't it? I wonder, Diana, if we can reflect on that pivotal moment, I suppose, when he was on that flight in Berlin, heading back to Russia, because he was poisoned in 2020, but decided to come back in 2021. That was a big moment for him.
He did post earlier this year on Instagram that he was constantly being asked why he came back to Russia when he did, and whether it was some kind of conspiracy and whether he'd sort of struck a deal with someone. And he was like, look, it's really simple. I have my country and my beliefs, and I don't want to give up on either of them. And I can't betray either the first or the second. If your beliefs are worth something, you have to be ready to stand by them, and if necessary, to make sacrifices. And he's made the sacrifice of his family. He has an amazing wife, Yulia, who has stood by his side all of this time. She's now at the Munich Security Conference. I cannot imagine what she is feeling. And he has a son and a daughter. His daughter, Dasha, has stood up and spoken about her father and his fight. She's a student in the US. The little boy is still at school. So he has sacrificed his relations with them by going back to Russia. He must have known he did know he would be jailed. And now it has cost him his life.
We know that elections are coming up in the coming weeks. How big a threat was he to Putin?
I think any kind of threat Putin will suppress. That is the nature of the head of a repressive regime. And if you look at the last 24 years of Putin's rule, it has become ever more repressive. But I think the threat that Alexei Navalny represented was twofold. It was A, that as a political force who pushed for freedom of speech, freedom for the Russian people, freedom of expression, freedom, just all the freedoms that are not existent in Russia. And then highlighting the kind of corruption once he was not allowed to run as a political candidate because the courts basically said that because he had charges against him for corruption, he couldn't be run for president or for any other political office. Then he turned his attentions to exposing corruption through his organization, the Anti-Corruption Foundation, which is labeled an extremist organization in Russia and has basically been hounded out of there alongside all the representatives in the various cities where it had branches. Either you've left Russia if you worked for his foundation or you're locked up now. And the majority of the Russian people did not believe in Alexei Navalny's message. They didn't really understand why they should back him politically. But I think his anti-corruption message resonated further because people don't like seeing kind of mid-level corruption and seeing it right up at the top. And that's why you saw these huge demonstrations, 2016, 2017, 2018, against corruption. And again, when his Putin's Palace investigation came out in 2021, huge numbers of people going out into the street. And Putin doesn't like any kind of protest. I mean, now you're not allowed to protest. You haven't been since COVID. So, of course, Alexei Navalny represented a threat. And the fact that he still managed to get his message out of prison must have annoyed the Kremlin too. But it still does seem like very peculiar timing for this to happen so close to the election. It's on March the 17th, a little more than 3 weeks' time. And if you want any clearer indication, if anyone was under any illusions as to the nature of the Putin regime.
Let's talk about Navalny's lasting impact. You said there perhaps he wasn't a household name, but he did speak to a section of Russian society that would want to see an end to the war in Ukraine. Things like that, a free Russia. What will be his lasting impact, do you think, on Russia?
There will have been various moments in this deeply changed Russia that we see since February the 24th, 2 years ago, when Putin launched his all-out war on Ukraine. There have been several crucial moments that have been felt domestically. One was the war itself. One was mobilization. And I do think that Alexei Navalny's death will be one of those moments which causes people in Russia to stop and question the nature of their government. I don't think it will change anything, because people don't have the capacity to change. They don't have the tools. They're not allowed to do anything to change things. That's what Alexei Navalny was trying to change. But I think those moments may add up. They are important. And I think his legacy as someone incredibly brave who was prepared to stand up for what he felt was right, who was prepared to return to a country that was actively trying to kill him, is something that resonates across the world. You know, we don't get many examples of that kind of bravery, of those kind of figures to look up to and go, you know, I may not have agreed with everything you said, but God, you were brave in what you were doing. And he was one of those characters.
We'll pause there because after the break we'll be analysing those by-election wins for Labour and how it shapes the run-up to the general election with our correspondent Rob Powell. That's what a delighted Labour Party sounds like, and not surprisingly, since they won comfortably in the two by-elections in what were Conservative safe seats of Kingswood and Wellingborough. But let's look at what it all means with our political correspondent, Rob Powell. He's in sunny Wellingborough now.
It was a disastrous result for the Conservatives, to be frank. I don't think there's any other word for it. In terms of swings, so sort of voters going away in general anyway, that's how you do it statistically, from Tories to Labour, it was almost the very worst by-election result that the Tories have had ever. It's only beaten by a few fraction of a percent by Dudley in the mid-90s. The spin that they're trying to sort of put on it is whether this is Labour winning the votes or whether this is basically just disillusioned Tories staying at home.
You've been in Wellingborough for a bit now. People are milling around behind you in the market square, buying their veg and treats for Friday evening. But what are they saying to you? Is it a surprise to local people?
We've come across a couple of people that said that they'd always voted Conservative and they'd gone Labour. So that backs up what Labour have been saying, that there have been some straight switchers. Another gentleman that said he always voted Conservative but stayed at home this time round. We did get someone that did vote Conservative and thought that, as the economy improves, things would get better for them. And in terms of what was motivating the people to go against the Tories and go Labour this time round, actually it was very similar to what we've heard in other big by-election losses that the Tories have had. It was those core issues around things like the NHS, things like cost of living, but also quite local issues. Potholes was something that was brought up by the new MP in her little speech that she did on these steps actually a little while ago. And that was something that was brought up by one woman that I talked to. They said they just seem to come and fill them in with a square of concrete and then the lorries come over them and they bash them back open again. So it's sort of one of those issues that sometimes journalists in London sort of turn their nose up a bit and laugh about. But it's really important, especially in places like Wellingborough, when a lot of people do use their cars. And it was sort of striking the way one person put it was, they said they lived in Wellingborough for a very long time, and the way that the high street and the general state of the town had declined, she said it almost made you feel ashamed of the town. So there's this sort of sense that something isn't working, and you find a lot of people talking about, well, maybe it's time for a change. But I think what is maybe worrying for Labour and worrying for Keir Starmer is no one seems that convinced that Labour and Keir Starmer will actually be able to deliver that change. But they just think that they might as well roll the dice given how bad things are at the moment.
The other big story of the night was Reform UK. What do you think their role is then, Rob? They're quite disruptive, aren't they? Particularly for Rishi Sunak, who does want to gloss over what's happened.
They did do well. They got about 13% of the vote here in Wellingborough. Did pretty well in Kingswood as well, not quite as well. They got about 10% there. And this was, I think, for Reform, the first real world kind of material test about whether some of the pretty impressive polling numbers that they've been clocking up in the last few months would materialise into reality. I think the answer is maybe a cautious yes. I mean, Reform is sort of one of those classic parties where people would vote them in a by-election because, quite frankly, it's not going to influence who's becoming Prime Minister. But then when you get to a general election, they might not. And I think that is the fundamental question that Reform haven't really got an answer to yet, to be honest. The Tory attack on Reform in this constituency, and that we've heard from Rishi Sunak today, is, look, if you vote Reform, you're making it more likely that Keir Starmer gets in. So if you're a voter that wants to see a more right-wing approach, why on earth would you vote Reform? Because you're making it more likely that a Labour government is formed.
We'll move on to Rishi Sunak, because as I said, he wanted to gloss over this, but it is a shattering defeat for them. Where does he go forward? Because what he'll have when he returns on Monday to Parliament is the plotters, and whether their whispers start to grow even stronger. We know Simon Clarke had his letter that he put in a few weeks ago, but where do you think we stand there?
I'm not convinced that it necessarily changes the equation with the wider Tory parliamentary party and Tory MPs enough to make this kind of existential for Rishi Sunak. I mean, if we look practically at the process of what might happen, could it lead to more letters of no confidence going in? Potentially. If that happens, there's a vote of no confidence. Would a majority of the parliamentary party vote to get Rishi Sunak out? I don't think it's going to happen, to be honest, because I think if you listen to Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is by no means a fan of Rishi Sunak, even he is saying it would be quite mad to talk about changing leader. And I think that is the conclusion that a lot of Tory MPs come to. And I think we saw that after Simon Clarke went public with saying that Rishi Sunak should go and writing that article saying he wasn't the right person for the job. You actually saw a lot of Tory MPs kind of rallying around Rishi Sunak, if anything. So I think for Rishi Sunak, that the kind of vulnerability and the weakness that he has is almost his sort of protection and armour in this, because the Tory party has been in such chaos for such a long time, and because they've swapped leaders so many times, there is a reluctance to do it again, because most people think that it would make the situation worse. And I think the hope really for the Tory government will be that over time, as the economy hopefully improves, but of course we've got the news this week that we're in a recession, so that's by no means nailed on. I think the hope is that stuff starts to get better and they can really start to make this argument that the plan is working, and Labour will put that at risk.
Yeah, but then Labour, their lead in the polls, that's solid, isn't it? It's not really changed, whether it's the dialing back on the 28 billion green funding policies, whether it's their issues with Israel. All of these things haven't really dented that poll lead for Labour and Sir Keir Starmer. And this morning, he was out doing the rounds saying, this is wonderful for Labour. We're in such a good spot. But like you said, there would have been lots of people, perhaps, who were not voting for Starmer, but perhaps a protest against the Tory party.
You're making a really good point. A couple of people we've spoken to today, one person describes, I asked, well, what do you think about Keir Starmer? And they both sort of laughed in a kind of despairing way and said, well, he's a bit wishy-washy. And these were people that were happy that Labour got in this by-election. So when the Tories say, there's no big appetite for Keir Starmer, I think there's something in that, that I think Labour still have a lot to prove. This clearly shows that there is a very solid lead that they have, because they are still chalking up these absolutely stunning wins, quite frankly, despite having all these rough and tumble days earlier this week. But I think what I'd say, and this is where I think the 28 billion and what happened with Azhar Ali is quite relevant, is that when you get into a general election campaign and there is far more scrutiny on the policy, far more scrutiny on the politics and the candidates, the quality of your kind of strategic decision-making matters a lot more. Labour have got a long way to go in terms of convincing people, laying out what they stand for and what their policies are. And I think in doing that, there is a high degree of risk if they make wrong calls that it could fall through.
Who do you think's had the worst week then? Because at the start of the week, we all thought perhaps it was Labour. Rishi Sunak now is the one that's got the biggest headache moving forward, do you think?
100% the Conservatives have had the worst week. 2 thumping by-election losses, up there with some of the worst by-election losses they have ever had to Labour. That's bad. The news of a technical recession a couple of days ago is awful as well, because it goes against one of Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges that he has set his entire premiership against. One of them, I will grow the economy. That completely undermines that. Labour, look, they started off not having a good week at all, but I think as serious as the story and the allegations around Azhar Ali and what he said was, as serious as that story was, I think it sort of does show sometimes you sort of wonder how much kind of penetration that has in terms of actually shifting votes around in the real world.
Are we heading, before you go, I don't know if you're a betting man, Rob, but are we heading for a Labour government, do you think?
Look, I think it's fair to say the Conservatives have got a mountain to climb between now and the general election. Rishi Sunak said today that these were mid-term results, and mid-term by-elections were always difficult. This isn't mid-term, though. This is not 2 years until the general election. We're probably talking 6 to 9 months until the general election. So the fact that you have a fairly consistent, 15 to 20 point poll lead for Labour, combined with 28-point swings, and Labour taking places like mid-Bedfordshire on one side, and then the Lib Dems threatening the Tories in other sort of true blue seats in the other direction, and then this kind of triple threat of reform coming along as well, means that all the elements are there for it to be a disastrous general election for the Tories and a very good one for Labour. But look, I've kind of learned over the last 8 years of politics not to make too many predictions, because stuff can change.
That's all from us on the Sky News Daily. Thanks to Diana and Rob. We'll be back next week.